further hearing sessions being held in respect of the examination of the Bayborough and Mid Suffolk Joint Local Plan. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alison Partington, and along with my colleague Malcolm Rivett, I've been appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the soundness and legal compliance of the plan. Before we start today's discussion, there are a number of housekeeping points that I need to run through. Some of these will be very familiar to some of you, others will not less so please bear with me as I go through them. Firstly, to avoid disruption to the proceedings, can I ask everyone to ensure that their mobile phones and laptops are turned to silent while the hearings are in session? I'm sure that most of you are now very familiar with Teams, but just a few reminders that I need to go through. You should be aware that the proceedings are being live streamed via YouTube in order for the general public to be able to observe them both in real time and in the future. Anyone who makes their own recording of the hearing session or any part of them should ensure that they comply with the law in terms of any distribution they make of the recording. When you're not speaking, please can you make sure your microphone is on mute. Whilst the discussion is ongoing, you may wish to have your camera either on or off when not speaking, although it would be helpful to me if the main council witnesses would keep their cameras on. If you'd like to contribute to the discussion, please can you use the raised hand function. When I invite you to speak, remember to unmute your microphone and put your camera on, please, remembering to mute yourself afterwards and take down your raised hand. Please make your contributions brief, focused and relevant to the question that I've asked. If necessary, we'll take a short break mid-morning and we should be finished at the very latest by around 1 o'clock. Before we start the discussion, I think it would be useful just to remind people of how we've reached this point in the examination. Most people here will recall that we had hearing sessions into the plan which were held in the autumn of 2021. As a result of those, we wrote to the council setting out our significant concerns about the robustness of the housing site selection process and the related spatial strategy. To address this, we suggested modifying the plan to make it become a Part 1 plan, deleting from it the housing site allocations and the spatial strategy to become matters which would be addressed in a subsequent Part 2 plan. We also indicated that in the light of the written evidence and relevant hearing discussions, a range of other modifications to various aspects of the plan were necessary. The council subsequently prepared and considered through sustainability appraisal and habitat regulation assessment the necessary main modifications to the plan, and these modifications were subject to public consultation earlier this year. In relation to the majority of the proposed main modifications, we are satisfied that there is no need for any further discussion at the hearings and will consider the consultation comments on a written representation basis. However, we consider that further discussions would be helpful for us on 4 specific matters, which are the subject of the various hearing sessions this week. We wish to emphasise that we'll only be discussing those specific matters and that the main modifications that relate to them. The format of the session is a structured discussion which I'm going to lead, focusing on the points set out in the previously circulated agenda. All previously submitted written evidence is to be taken as read and need not be repeated at length. In a moment, I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves, but before I do so, does anyone have any procedural questions? On that basis, please could I ask the council to start off with by introducing themselves.
Morning, Madam. If I introduce the council's team, and I suspect you'll be hearing more from them than from me, given the nature of the agenda items this morning. My name is Michael Bedford, King's Counsel, and I'm providing the legal advice and support to the council team. And then joining us today, and you're likely to hear most from Jennifer Candler, the Senior Policy Planner, who you can see, Then also present is Robert Hobbs, the Strategic Planning Manager, Tom Barker, the Director, and you'll also see Councillor Andrew Stringer. I'm not expecting really anything will be from any of those other parties, but it will be primarily Ms. Candler. Thank you, sir. Thank
you very much. I'll just now run through the other people that I'm expecting to be here. Ms. Saunders, could you introduce yourself and who you're representing?
Yes, good morning. I'm Professor Saunders. I'm Spatial Planning Advisor from Anglian Water.
Thank you. Yeah. Mr. Davidson.
Good morning. I'm Charlie Davidson. I'm Director of Davidson, Poultry House, Livestock, building manufacturer based in Mid-Suffolk.
I'm really struggling to hear you, Mr. Davidson. Your volume keeps going on and off.
So I'm sorry, Inspector. We did have connection problems with Mr. Davidson first thing, and I thought we'd solved them, but that sound quality's.
Am I back?
Try again, Mr. Davidson. Closer.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, apologies. My laptop is having a moment. Yeah, so I'm a director of C. Davidson Limited. We are an intensive livestock and poultry building company based in Stradbroke. We've been in the area for 75 years, building mainly poultry farms in East Anglia.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rankin? No, Mr. Rankin's not here. Right. Mrs. Ives?
Good morning. Yes, Susan Ives. I've been researching intensive poultry and livestock units throughout Suffolk for the last 4 years and elsewhere in the country. I'm representing myself.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vladon?
Good morning. I'm Odile Vladon. I represent Thorndon Parish Council and Stradbroke Parish Council. I'm the clerk to both.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cutting? Or Mr. Barber from the County Council?
Good morning, ma'am. You should be able to hear and see me now. Yes, I'm James Cutting. I'm Head of Planning of Suffolk County Council. I'm also being supported by Natalie Winspear and Luke Barber, and another colleague, Georgia, is in the room as well, ably doing technology for us.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that's everyone then, isn't it? Because Mrs. Vladon's representing 2 parish councils. So we'll turn now to the discussion. And I thought it'd be helpful just to set the context. Obviously, this is a new policy that has been added to the plan at main modification stage, and it was added in response to the significant evidence that was produced by third parties at the Regulation 19 consultation stage, and the discussions held regarding this evidence at the previous hearing sessions in the autumn of 2021. So turning to the first question on the agenda and the potential overlap between the policy and other regulatory regimes, and whether the policy in light of this is consistent with national policy. Now, Mr. Davidson, I know that you've made quite a number of detailed comments on that, and I'd like to kind of run through those. Durant had also made comments on those, but they haven't turned up, so I think I'm going to be asking you quite a lot of questions. I hope you don't mind.
I'll do my best.
But taking your kind of comments kind of in turn, I know you've suggested that a number of clauses in the policy, I think it was 1A, 1B, 1D, 1E and part 3 are contrary to paragraph 188 of the framework. I wondered if you could explain why. Is it just because you consider they're covered by the IPCC regs, and also, like, particularly in the light of the fact that both the Environment Agency and Natural England have have written in support of the policy and therefore clearly think that the policy doesn't overlap with their kind of regimes and it is complementary to it. So I just wondered if you could explain your kind of position briefly to me.
Well, I would just like to say the man from Durrance, Johnny Rankin, is trying to get into the meeting. I'm being told from my end. But in answer to your question, yes, I think the overlap is completely unnecessary. Though whether the Environment Agency and Natural England agree, they're already doing the job. We are already fighting, as an industry, fighting for the right to achieve planning permission with heavy resistance, but not necessarily by the Environment Agency or Natural England, who have their thresholds, they have their bars, but by, I would say, anti-lobby groups, of which there are only a few, however, are making themselves known. But the idea that these things need to be repeated under a policy that is specifically aimed at one industry, and I would have to say it's not even necessarily aimed at one industry, it's off the back of the success of one company that have grown within the Mid-Suffolk area. And while I believe there is some fear that this is the thin end of the wedge and that their growth is going to be exponential and that this policy has to be implemented or else the whole of Mid-Suffolk will be covered with poultry sheds, I think there is a lack of understanding that the growth that's happened in the industry is not by building new, but by redistribution of existing buildings. And I believe that this policy is covered by a myriad of policies within the MPPF and is unnecessary to have this specific industry focus.
Thank you. I'll just come back. I see Mr. Rankin has been able to join the meeting now. Welcome to you, Mr. Rankin. Do you just want to introduce yourself and I'll just explain where we're up to?
Many thanks. Yes, good morning. Followed an incorrect link, I'm afraid, but I'm with you now. It's Johnny Rankin, Principal Planner at Durrance, and Jasmine Philpott, Planner here at Durrance as well.
Thank you. We just started item 1 on the agenda, and I just asked Mr. Davidson about particularly comments on of clauses 1A, 1B, 1D, 1E, and Part 3, and why, which I think were explained were contrary, or views were expressed that they were contrary to paragraph 188 of the framework. And I asked why you considered that to be the case. Was it just because it was covered by the IPCC regs, and particularly in the light of the fact that, the Environment Agency and Natural England have both given support to this policy and in that sense, obviously didn't feel it overlapped with their regimes at all. And I just wondered whether you had any comments on that at all.
Well, I agree that the policy effectively doubles or indeed triples up on other, namely planning, permitting and EIA matters. Was it specifically criteria A you were discussing?
Well, I was going to go through it because I've had detailed comments from both you and Mr. Davidson. I was taking kind of them in turn. So it was 1A, 1B, 1D, 1E and Part 3, which I think had all been kind of specifically raised to be contrary to paragraph 188. And I was just trying to understand, why you considered it was those parts were contrary to that paragraph. I say particularly given the support of the policy from the Environment Agency.
Yeah, no problem. So to be specific on the matter, I think it's important to the root of our concern is that we have a very specific policy introduced at a very late stage, absent the Reg 19 consultation, without an evidence base published, and the associated sustainability appraisal. So I think firstly it's to raise how did this get inserted at this potentially 11th hour?
Can I just
when you move to the
can I just stop you because you missed my introduction, which did explain that it came in the light of discussion. I mean, at regulating 19 stage, there was significant evidence put to me from various third parties regarding this, and in the light of that and the discussions held on that evidence at the hearing sessions, that's how the policy came into being inserted in at this stage. So that was the evidence base, and it obviously has been through a sustainability appraisal as part of the main modifications phase. So yeah, but do continue.
Understood. But in our one of the mail consideration of the consultation, we that wasn't perhaps explicit. What is explicit is that section 15, part 15 of the proposed local plan has a suite of very detailed policies, all to do with the environment, namely policies LP 17 through policy LP 29, which are fit for any type of development, inclusive of intensive livestock and poultry. So then if we move to criteria A, and in light of the fact that we have several relevant regimes to such developments, and if you're over a threshold, as you well know, in the EIA regs, there's going to be considerable assessment purpose to finding the potential for significant effects. So why then do we need a local policy that introduces subjective matters and subjective language when there's a level of assessment there that's well above and beyond matters of planning judgment and subjectivity? So language like serve to protect the amenity of residential properties, when you have purpose policies within the plan in respect of amenity. If we were a fracking developer and we wanted to put in a pro-fracking policy, that would be roundly dismissed, I'm sure. So why, as a lobby group, why has a lobby managed to get a purpose policy into a plan? As Durance, we represent our clients and we want a sound development plan at which to work with the council in bringing forward a development plan. We haven't sought to lobby or otherwise politically influence this as a regulatory process. So that's my concern. My main concern is matters of subjectivity, which are doubling, if not tripling up, very adequate existing provisions.
And how does that make, how do you consider that makes it contrary to paragraph 188?
118 is clear. I haven't got the wording before me. I can do momentarily, but it paraphrasing here, it effectively says those regimes, in that case permitting, it is assumed, it is understood that they will function in the way they're expected to, in the same way that the existing EIA regulations will, and any incoming environmental outcome reports. Yeah, so 188. Yeah, it tells us as planning practitioners to focus on planning policies and the development and the use of land, not to concern ourselves with matters that are dealt with under other regimes. That is what is expected on behalf of the applicants.
Thank you. Is there anything the council or anyone else wants to say in response, particularly on that point, before we move on to some of the other points? Ms. Fladon?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there are two planning appeal outcomes, one in Thorndon and one in Shropshire, where that matter is addressed by the planning inspector. And they say that despite my observations regarding relationship between other regulatory regimes and the planning system, I conclude the proposed development in land use terms would adversely affect the living conditions of existing and future occupiers. And in the other one, it says, regarding paragraph 188. However, development may have effects which, although not of such severity to amount to pollution for the purposes of applying a pollution regime, are nevertheless material in planning terms. So those are two planning outcomes that dismiss the appeal and the grounds for because it contradicted 188. The policy has been essayed and been through the HRA, and the HRA found that there was a positive negative impact, but these could be overcome by the matters embedded in the policy. So it now complies with the HRA and the SA.
Thank you. Mr. Bedford.
Thank you, Madam. Just briefly, obviously we've sought to answer this issue in our summary response. That's H46, which obviously we don't need to repeat. And the simple point is that we see that there are clearly some areas that are dealt with by planning, which would not be caught by the other regulatory regimes, whether that's EIA, which obviously has a threshold of significant effects only. So EIA doesn't catch things which don't have significant effects, and that's effectively a term of art. And so far as the environmental permitting regime, that bites if you need a permit, but it wouldn't bite if you already got a permit, but you're doing something which might need planning permission, but doesn't take you outside of your existing permit. So that's the first point. There isn't actually a duplication. There are things that planning does that those other regimes don't do. And then also there are things that planning looks at, even where they're covering related topics, which the other regimes don't look at. And the obvious example of that is cumulative effects of more than one development. And so we see there as being a proper role for the policy. We don't see it as being in conflict with 188 of the MPPF, and we're reinforced, as it were, and comforted by the fact that the other regulatory agencies support the policy and don't see this as creating any issue of inconsistent decision making or duplication of decision making. Madam, those really are our points.
Thank you. Mrs. Ives?
Yes, I was going to make exactly that same point about the cumulative impact, and specifically also identify Herefordshire, where they have conducted many studies on human health and well-being, and most recently in July 2022, in a task group and report that was produced, the failure at national level to allow the cumulative impact of IPUs to be taken into account when seeking individual permit applications from the Environment Agency has led to an exponential increase in IPUs county-wise. And I think that's the most important point, that this policy is looking to essentially allow this development, but in areas where it is going to have minimum impact on other objectives within the plan.
Thank you. Ms. Candler?
Thank you, ma'am. If I may run through the criteria which you've highlighted. With regard to 1A, in terms of protecting the amenity of residential properties as a pollution prevention measure, again, in line, Mr. Bedford said, part of the consideration is about the staging of that consideration, and we consider it appropriate that is considered in the determination of a planning application, is that impact of on residential amenity. It is appropriate to consider because it could render a proposal unacceptable in planning terms. So we consider that's correct to do so through the planning application process. With regard to 1B, in terms of biodiversity and ecology, having particular regard to the effectiveness of on-site pollution prevention measures, again, looking at that through the siting and the design consideration stage of planning, and using the policy as a pollution prevention measure to enable those considerations through that process. We consider that appropriate. 1D was with regard to sensitive receptors from air pollutants and the ability to consider the modelling of such. And mitigation against air pollutant receptors can be quite problematic to secure as a retrospective measure, looking at it through, again, planning where it enables to be done up front through looking at the appropriateness of the design and siting. Again, it's the same issue. And with regard to 1E, looking at the responsibility to adequately assess the direct and indirect of the environmental impacts of waste management, it is the local planning authority's responsibility to do so through the process.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to move on then to just part 1B, particularly. I know that the council, in the addendum to the statement of common ground with Natural England, which they published last week, suggested some revised wording for that part 1B. I just wondered whether anyone had any comments on that revised wording at all. Yes, Mrs. Vadon.
It's only for consistency. Given that the word appropriate is used in 1B, could we change in 1D the word approved to appropriate? Because there are different forms of emission modelling and different ones are more appropriate to different applications. So it says in 1D, through submission of approved emission modelling, could that say appropriate to reflect 1B so that they're consistent?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does the council have any view on that at all?
It's probably splitting hairs somewhat, but I think we would agree that consistency is desirable, but we think actually the consistency perhaps should be the other way round, and the approved emission modelling is what should really be required. In other words, it needs to be modelling which is fit for purpose, and therefore, if it's approved by the relevant regulatory bodies, then it is fit for purpose.
Could we split hairs and say approved appropriate, because there are different variants of the approved, and some of them are appropriate and some of them are not. So if we had approved appropriate.
Well, Madam, I think we'd leave it with you. We don't want to overcomplicate matters, but I think we're probably all marching in the same direction. But I say what we want to avoid is, I say, overcomplicating it.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Davidson?
Yeah, I'd just like to support what's just been said, that keep it simple. We're facing challenges at the moment where approved modelling is being challenged by saying it's not appropriate modelling, costing people thousands of pounds and months and months of time. Approved is an entirely appropriate way of putting it. And if the Environment Agency say that something is the right way to do it, then who is to say that they're wrong?
Thank you. I'll consider those, thank you. If we can just then move on to the fact that I think various clauses, like 1C, 1F and 1G, I think Mr. Davidson, you suggested that they're covered by various paragraphs in the other paragraphs in the MPPF, and I just wondered why you considered that the fact that they were covered by other paragraphs necessarily made them unnecessary, because obviously the MPPF is only a material consideration in determining planning applications. So I just wondered why you considered they were unnecessary.
Well, where does it end? Why do we need to repeat what's already covered and is already being applied in the planning process to under a specific title of livestock and poultry. It seems unnecessary. I don't think there's one issue on here that isn't covered elsewhere, and I don't understand why we're sitting here really discussing intensive livestock and poultry when, I'll say it again, it's just covered elsewhere. And it's not easy to get planning permission. People are not just walking through.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to say anything particularly about the issue of the fact that some of these clauses are covered by other parts of the NPPF?
Well, Madam, I mean, say the point we've already made it, and Madam, you referred to it in your comments just then. Obviously, the development plan has a particular status in making development management decisions. Section 38(6) sets that out. The NPPF is obviously important policy, but it is policy rather than part of the development plan. I say that on the basis of the current legislation. Madam, you will know there are some possible proposals to change that, but obviously you can only examine this plan on the basis of current legislation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ms. Sives?
Yes, and just to reiterate in terms of the consistency with the NPPF, I think it does meet the needs set out in NPPF 7, 8 and 9. And in 9, suggests guiding development towards sustainable solutions, in doing so taking account local circumstances. And as you've already identified, there's a huge amount of evidential information that was provided throughout the examination process to suggest that this is in fact necessary. I think there's one other point to note as well, which in the sustainability appraisal, the report 23, the policy seeks to support this specific agricultural sector, which comprises a large component of the agricultural industry in Bayborough and Mid Suffolk, and a significant positive effect is expected against the SA Objective 114, which is the economy. And it also states on page 89 that the policy is appropriate to local circumstances.
That was page 89, did you say?
Yes. And the other comment I made about the positive effect is actually chapter 5, paragraph 5.213.
Thank you very much. Mr. Davison?
Yeah, I'm curious about the evidence that was put forward about how much interaction was actually carried out with the industry, especially in Mid Suffolk. I don't believe that anybody approached us as the only people that build them, or any of our customers, or the people who actually make decisions within the poultry industry. I believe the evidence put forward has been taken from issues in the West Country due to an inorganic growth within the industry, in that it rose up very quickly off the back of a failing dairy industry. You've obviously had a lot of information and a lot of what's been called evidence, but I don't know that much of it actually is particular to Mid Suffolk, and we've certainly not been asked to provide anything. And there was something else I was going to say that has escaped me, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Flaton, you want to come back? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that part of the policy is specific to Mid Suffolk because it references the Hartismere Water Resource Zone.
Thank you. Mr. Davidson, do you want to come back?
Yeah, on the issue of the Heart Water Resource Zone, that's already being applied. I can speak personally to the planning application we're currently working on. That was held up due to the Heart Water Resource. I don't see why it needs to be included. And the economic impact of the uncertainty this policy is hanging over planning matters within Mid-Suffolk has cost our company. Well, we used to employ 60 employees. We used to employ 40 subcontractors. We now have no subcontractors, and we have lost over 10% of our staff due to uncertainty. We had a man hand in his notice because he's going to become a gardener because he wants certainty of employment. But our employees are not unaware of what's going on. These challenges we're facing and the looming uncertainty because of this policy is costing us hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it is going to cost others within our industry millions.
And you say it's related to this policy. Is it? Well, how is this policy alone having such an impact on
that? The lack of decision making over poultry applications right now is because this policy sits there linked. I might be wrong, judging by the faces of some people, I'm wrong, but we have a planning application right now that would secure employment for our company for 4 to 6 months, and it sits there undecided. We have, and it's not just Mid-Suffolk, there are other district councils that are not making decisions on poultry applications, and I suspect that there will be a large move for other people to have an intensive livestock and poultry farming policy that will enormously impact the industry that has not been consulted or engaged with.
Thank you. Ms. Saunders, do you want to come in about that Hertsmere? Because I want to pick up that really under part 3 of the agenda rather than now. But so is your point just about that? And just should we hold it to part 3?
That's what I was going to ask, if you wanted to leave it to later in the agenda. Just going back to your original question in terms of the NPPF, I think it's clear in the NPPF that the local plans need to address water resources in their policy. So I think it's entirely appropriate that's addressed in this policy.
Thank you. Yeah. Ms. Candler.
Thank you, ma'am. Firstly, I apologise. I didn't hear everything Mr. Davidson said. He sort of looped in and out slightly, but I think I picked up most of the points that were raised. With regard to the application it's been referred to and the impact this policy's had on it, my understanding is that that application was submitted back in December 21. So actually the application was submitted prior to the policy being drafted. Now, part of the council's intent behind this policy, we understand these applications are complex and a lot of the considerations sit between different licensing regimes. So part of the aim of the policy is to be very clear of the considerations that would be relevant to an application, so that both applicants are aware of what information would be compiled and considered through the application process, as well as the communities that are consulted upon. So hopefully in the long run, it may make a swifter determination process for applicants.
Thank you. I was going to ask that question a bit later, but yes, thank you. And I think comments have also been made about the fact, and Mr. Davidson's picked up on this a bit, that it's would hinder the rural economy. I just wondered whether anyone else had any comments about the impact and why they consider it would hinder the local economy or not. is Ms. Vadam.
I just wanted to repeat that the essay found that it was a plus against the objective of economy. So the essay didn't find that it would hinder it.
Yes, Mr. Davidson.
Did that essay ask anyone within the industry how this might impact them? And,
I was going to say, Madam, you will have seen the essay, and obviously it was carried out on a standard basis across all of the subjects that were assessed. So it didn't include direct consultation with particular bodies on particular policies, because it was clearly an objective approach applying the criteria and methodology that are set out in the essay. So that's the specific answer to Mr. Davidson's particular query, but clearly you've got the essay and we consider it fit for purpose.
Could I just very quickly go back? I absolutely would encourage a streamlining of the planning process of what is sometimes a complicated matter when it comes to livestock and poultry. And while absolutely I would like to see that, and I think it would help us as applicants, what will always be an issue, whether LP14 is introduced or not, is not the planning policy, but the lack of understanding of the technology within the industry. And a question raised about one specific item of equipment on a poultry farm is always, with this policy or not, going to cost us time. So we may say it streamlines it because it allows us to set our ducks in a row, for want of a better word, but without understanding of the internal workings of poultry farming, pig farming, what equipment is and what it actually does, all it takes for certain anti-groups to stand in the way of an application for intensive livestock and poultry is to ask a question. All that has to be done, and that will not change with this policy. It just needs to be one question about, we don't understand how this piece of equipment works, and until we have an absolutely clear answer supported by a document that costs someone thousands of pounds to produce, we are not going to remove our objection, whoever that objection is from, whether it's a parish council or the Environment Agency. This may streamline it in paperwork terms, but it will not make the process any easier for people who actually have to run these applications. And it just seems another layer on top. It will cost the industry more money. And I don't really know who it's to satisfy, other than anti-lobby groups.
But in terms of the fact that you have to apply for planning permission, or generally will have to apply for a planning permission, the fact that it's setting out the criteria, you know, how it's going to be judged, how does that add an extra layer of?
Because we already know what we have to do. Planning applications are always tricky, and there are thousands of pages of documents, of course. But we know what we have to do from experience. There are planning agents out there who are well versed in it, and Mr. Rankin hopefully is going to say something on this. I believe this is a policy that begins today but gets added to in years and years until certain groups of people can stand in the way of all agriculture being built in mid-Suffolk. And it will be hindrance to our economy.
Mr. Rankin?
Yeah, simply just to say that accepting this policy has been found sound. It introduces language which is subjective, above and beyond It introduces matters of subjectivity, on matters that are well covered under other sections, section 15 of the plan. And I believe it does that for a purpose. It deliberately introduces subjective matters because it was written by people that wish to, introduce such subjective language and matters. That's the concern here.
And in terms of my question, in terms of like how, when you've got to apply for planning permission, how does a policy that explains what might be required or needs to be addressed, how does that add an extra layer of difficulty to the process?
So with respect, utmost respect, we know exactly what we need to provide. The planning process, and where appropriate, the EIA process is well established, long-standing. We've submitted to Mid Suffolk alone several poultry applications, notwithstanding, the other regional planning authorities. It's language like serve to protect, improvement in the existing, adequate provision, minimise visual and landscape impact, appropriate justification. These are subjective words and subjective sentences. And, forgive me for suggesting it, but a lazy or minded officer could pick up upon the subjective instead of going to the more objective and evidence-based constituent assessments of a planning application or accompanying EIA. That, I think, is a frustration perhaps for the industry and for practitioners such as ourselves. Why introduce these subjective matters when we have a very clear, tested route before us? Thank you.
And where is that? I mean, you say it's a clear route. Where is that set down for anyone else who is applying for it? How do they know? You said how does anyone else know that maybe is applying?
Yeah, sure. So if we take the hypothetical, it would be that first stage, that pre-app, and then screening stage, and then thereafter, where required, scoping, and then obviously the EIA thereafter, if it's determined that that's appropriate, the consultation process associated with any given planning application at any level, EIA, non-EIA, and all the opportunities for response through that process. So I think the frustration that you're hearing comes from the issues we are already having in terms of, we are planning practitioners, but we represent the development community. You will understand that then a policy that is, we work on a range of applications, biomass, for example. There isn't a biomass specific policy here, yet there is a specific poultry policy that introduces subjective matters. I think that's the frustration here. As it happens, all the schemes we're working on comply with all the elements of LP14. So it's a moot point, it's academic, but why introduce these subjective matters? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Davidson, you want to come back in?
I think the subjectivity of some of the wording is absolutely a valid point. In 1B, it talks about appropriate pollution prevention measures and supported by demonstrable on-site contingency measures. Well, demonstrable requires someone to say what they think is logically appropriate. Well, as someone who builds these buildings and works with them every day, I know that a lot of the measures that maybe someone who's carrying out modeling, someone who doesn't understand what goes into these buildings calls logical, is entirely illogical and entirely inappropriate. The wording like demonstrable just seems, and it has crept into quite a few policies, I believe, in the modifications, but it just seems entirely inappropriate and open to so much resistance.
Mr. Bedford.
Thank you, Madam. Madam, I think we would say that the language that this policy uses as proposed in the modifications is perfectly standard across the JLP as a whole. There are no, as it were, criteria that you won't find that language deployed generally in the plan. And it is of the nature of planning, where planning judgments have to be made. Sometimes there are objective external criteria that you can benchmark a particular consideration against, and some planning judgments require a more, as it were, bespoke planning judgment, and it doesn't lend itself to an external benchmark in a sense. If you could do everything by external benchmarks, a lot of planners, including possibly Mr. Rankin, would be unemployed, because it would just be a tick box exercise of measuring things against, I say, external benchmarks. I say some things have to be matters of judgment, and we don't see anything in LP14 which is inappropriate for allowing decision makers to make those judgments. Perhaps what you might have detected from some of the comments being made this morning, that there is probably a genuine need for better dialogue between the industry promoters and those who have developments either taking place in their communities or indeed the local authorities. And certainly I don't think the council would be in any way averse to helping to achieve that better dialogue. And that may be something that those interested in promoting would like to pursue, because I say all industries like to have a good understanding of their industry by those that regulate them. And I don't think there's any, in a sense that the council wouldn't like to have a good understanding too. Thank you.
Ms. Candler.
Thank you. Just following on from that point, the council would absolutely welcome that engagement. And in our local development scheme, should this policy be adopted, we are looking to produce an SPD to supplement the policy, hopefully to set out some of the matters of the criteria where such benchmarks exist. So it would be liaising with the industry and liaising with the other organisations, be it EA, Natural England and so on. So we have the SPD as a mechanism should the policy come into place, where we could actually put a lot of that detail and use that as a way to enable that dialogue as well and set out some clarity or some further clarity. Thank you.
Mr. Davidson.
Yeah, as a member of the industry, like I said, we build poultry housing. We also run poultry farms, and we are in relationship with people who work with industry who would be open to a dialogue. We have tried to have a dialogue with parish councils, and some have been receptive, some have not. Where people have been receptive and asked questions and had answers, I believe they have had a lot of their fears assuaged. The lack of relationship and lack of dialogue is frustrating, and we would welcome it.
And Mr. Rankin.
Yes, just picking up on a couple of recent points. There was at one time a poultry working group, and I certainly accepted the invitation to be on that group, and that acceptance remains today. Slightly alarmed to hear that we are discussing a poultry policy that isn't yet adopted and sound, yet there is a requirement for an SPD. If this is a sound policy and can be made, why do we need an SPD to explain that to everybody? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything else anyone wants to say on kind of part one of the agenda before I move on to part two? Right. Well, part two was just a question about the consistency of part 1G with it, particularly paragraph 111 of the framework. And I note that in the council's hearing statement produced last week, they've suggested alternative wording for this section that's been agreed with the County Council, I understand, and does better reflect the wording of paragraph 110 and 111 of the framework. I don't know whether the County Council want to come in and say anything, or whether anyone else has got any comments on this proposed wording at all.
Thank you, Madam. Natalie Winslow from County Council. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that I think our main area of concern was around the clarity of the wording of the original Part G, and particularly around phrases like adequate highway capacity and unacceptable increases in traffic volumes. We just wanted to bring that wording more in line with paragraph 111, which is what we would be using to judge a development. So I think that the way that we've agreed with Labour and Mid-Suffolk councils in the interim meets our requirements. So we're happy to move on unless anyone has any other comments to make.
Thank you. If there's no other comments on that, we can then move on to question 3 of the agenda, which is just looking at some of the clarity of the policy wording. And I think particularly Ms Saunders, I think you've raised the issue to the need to amend to provide greater clarity that it applies to new developments as well as the expansion of existing businesses. I just wondered if you could briefly explain your concern and perhaps whether you've got revised wording that you consider would be necessary to make the plan sound at all.
Yes, thank you, Tessa Saunders, Anglian Water. I think it was just a clarity of the policy to make sure that it does, it's clear that it does apply to both new and expanded intensive poultry and livestock units. I think it's just to recognise that the expansion of some of these livestock and poultry units can be indeed quite significant, and I think it's just add clarity in it, and obviously it has impacts on additional water supply depending on the scale of that expansion.
So, I mean, particularly as a wording that you would, anywhere, is it in that?
I think
just
yeah.
in the first.
Sorry. In the first clause, I think it would be helpful if it just applied to new or expanded intensive livestock and poultry proposals.
Ms Candler?
It's just to say the council would also welcome that clarification. The intent of the policy was to apply to both. So.
Thank you. And I think also, Ms Saunders, you've raised about the kind of the last part of 1C being removed, because you said it's kind of a wider water resource issue. Again, could you explain your concern with that, and why? I mean, I think the beginning bit does talk about the wider resources, and what but I know it's Hartsmere is if I got the right name for it, is a particular issue, and just your concerns over that part of the policy.
I think from Anglian Water's point of view, it's just to recognise that water resource constraints, particularly for non-domestic water demand, apply across all the water resource zones in the Anglian Water region. And although it's well established with the Essex and Suffolk Water, Hartismere water resource zone, that there are significant limitations there. There are also to a degree, there's also limitations within the Anglian water resource zones. I don't know if it's helpful for me to provide some context behind that and why we have those constraints.
Yes, that would be helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so it's sort of come to light over the last few months as we've been developing our water resources management plan. But it's as we have significant sort of non-domestic water requests, and there's constraints there now due to extraction reductions to limit the amount of water that's being taken from the environment, and the sort of longer term environmental destination that's being sought as set out in the 25-year environment plan, so essentially leave more water in the environment and take so much through abstraction. So as a result, we've got constraints across our water resource zones within Anglian Water, and in particular for non-domestic demand. So if I can just explain, we have legal obligations to supply domestic supplies for residential properties, both current residential and future, that's planned for in our water resource management plan. But also that's also domestic use for other employment uses, such as the drinking water, sanitary reasons in offices, hospitals, and schools. But where we don't have a sort of legal obligation to supply water is for non-domestic water supplies. That's for sort of processing and operations, industrial processes, that type of thing. So we're having to look very carefully at new requests for non-domestic water. And until we have strategic supply side options coming online, such as we've got plans for 2 new reservoirs and a strategic pipeline. So our ability to supply non-domestic water use is constrained. There isn't a moratorium on non-domestic water, but we do have very real constraints. So I think it'd be helpful if the sort of policy recognised that, and it was explained perhaps a bit more in the supporting text, that it's not just the Hartismere water resource zone, although recognising that there are more severe limitations there, but there are sort of other limitations across the Anglian water resource zones. And we do have now an external sort of policy position on that. And I recognise this has only just recently been made available from Anglian Water, so we're happy to share that with you. And just to add, I mean, I know that the local plan part 1 is positive in terms of water resource use, and it is. I think it's helpful in the employment land policy SP05, which is in the main modifications MM20. It does say about demonstrating the ability to secure water supply and having a water supply agreement where there's significant water use. I mean, I know it's depending on the scale of the intensive or livestock or poultry unit, but obviously there can be significant water users depending on the scale of those units.
Thank you. Mr. Bedford?
Thank you, Madam. Particularly taking into account those comments from Anglian Water, I just wonder whether inserting the word particularly into criterion C in front of the words taking account would perhaps meet the point that Anglian Water have made, because as I understand it, what they're saying is they don't deny or disagree that there is a particular constraint for Hartismere, but they say that's not the only consideration. We think the language already is wide enough to capture that point, but in a sense to provide comfort, it may be that if we added the word particularly in front of taking account, it would then make it clear that obviously the preceding is the general part, and that does obviously include having to look at the wider issue in terms of water supply and water resources, and then it also highlights the particular constraint of one particular location. Because what we wouldn't like to do is to lose, as it were, flagging up that particular issue, but we're absolutely in agreement that there is also a wider issue. So I just said, put that forward, and I wonder whether that's a way that Anglian Water might find, well, that meets their concern and that keeps everybody content.
Thank you. I mean, Ms. Saunders, do you have any comments on that suggestion?
I think I recognise, the council's position and the the absolute limitations there and hard to me. But I don't know if there can be some wording inserted into the supporting text, perhaps, just to more widely reflect the limitations on wider water resources in the wider resource zones, including within the Anglian water region. I don't know if it's helpful to reference somewhere across to that particular clause in SP Clause 6 and SP05 employment land in terms of the significant water use. So I think Faber and Mid Suffolk actually use the term heavy water usage, and so just so it does direct potential developers or applicants to engage with the water companies should they require significant water use. I think that would be helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Bedford, do you want to?
Yeah, and all I'd say is, I mean, since we're happy to look at whether something should go into the supporting text, but there is just always a slight danger of just sort of saying too much in every part of the plan. The plan obviously has to be read as a whole. We do think that water issues are adequately covered, but we're happy to look at, if you would welcome it, some wording to specifically go into the supporting text underneath this policy, if you think that would be a helpful thing for us to do.
Well, yeah, if you want to have a look and just see, and of course it also relates to LP. I think is it now LP 26 too also talks about water resources, doesn't it? So I mean, it may be just a reference to both of those in the supporting text. Might simply provide that.
Thank you, madam. We'll look at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Davison, I think you also raised some issues about 1C, and I think you felt the wording of it was ambiguous, and that you didn't feel it was necessary because of LP 26. Was there anything you wanted to particularly say at this point?
No, that sounds about right. Although water usage is obviously such a very important and valid issue for us to be addressing, surely it should have its own policy. You will miss surely so many areas of industry by making it so particularly tight to the livestock and poultry industry. Why focus entirely on one industry?
Well, I think I mean, from what Ms. Saunders was saying, that SP05 and LP 26 does pick those issues up for it's not just I mean, I think SP05 makes it very clear that industrial development
so we'll be addressing it in SP05 and then again in the livestock and intensive poultry policy.
Ms. Candler, do you want to?
Thank you. Yes, just to come back, it is listed in both policies in slightly different contexts. But again, I come back to the reason why we've put it out into LP14 is so it's a clear list of the comprehensive considerations for both applicants and all the consultees through the application process. So it's very clear for ILU use what the main considerations would be. It is an intensive water user, hence we've put it as part of this policy. So it's a comprehensive list of the relevant considerations in one place.
Thank you. And then just the final point on this one is, I think, picking up something that Mrs. Ives raised, just about the lack of consistency between paragraph 1414 and part 3 of policy in kind of one using must and one using should. I noticed that the council are quite happy to change that so there was consistency. I just wondered whether anyone else had any comments on that at all at this stage. No, that's great. Well, I think that answers all my questions. So unless there's anything else anyone wants to raise, just like to say thank you all for your contributions, and for those who are coming back for a second round this afternoon, I'll see you at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.